Over the last few weeks, I've been ranking gym leaders, Elite Four members, and most recently, League Champions. So in a natural progression of things, I think it's now time that I ranked every Superboss in Pokemon history. But before we get into that, I first need to give some parameters for what specifies a character as a Superboss in Pokemon. First, I do have to note that Superboss isn't technically a trainer class in Pokemon, and it's more or less just a fan-made classification. But with that being said, here's the criteria according to me for this video and for the rankings. First, it needs to be an optional post-game battle that never will affect the main story. Second, the opposing trainer needs to use a full team of 6 Pokemon. Third, every Pokemon the Superboss uses needs to be above level 60. And fourth, traditional league matches will not count. So that means no gym leaders, Elite Four, or champions, and that includes rematches. Then as for the rankings themselves in this video, they will mostly be based on how strong each Superboss is, or how much of a challenge they're likely to give you. Alright then, with all of that out of the way, let's get right into it. Coming in dead last is veteran Shaun. Ah yes, good old veteran Shaun. You simply can't tell the story of Pokemon without discussing veteran Shaun. Okay, but jokes aside, this is definitely the least memorable battle and character on the entire list. It's more or less just a random battle, and I was considering not putting him at all on this list. However, he does technically meet my criteria for this list, so I kinda had to add him. Now the battle with him occurs in Black and White's postgame deep within Challenger's Cave. And there's really not a lot to this battle at all. Shaun uses a Gyarados, Crobat, Snorlax, Excadrill, Druddigon, and Gigalith. 6 mons that are all alright, but nothing really jumps off the page at you. Honestly, a decent water type will kinda be able to mow down his entire team, so that obviously doesn't make this specific battle all that challenging. I guess his Pokemon will at the very least be pretty high leveled if you did indeed come here right after completing the main story. But I don't really have that much to say about Shaun. I guess I kinda like how his team is 50% Gen 1 and 50% Gen 5, but I'm just not too sure what Game Freak was going for with him. But overall, veteran Shaun is just forgettable, and he just doesn't really stack up that well against pretty much every other Superboss we'll see in this video. Next up is Serena or Callum. So obviously here we're looking at our main rival for the X and Y games. And I first have to start this entry by stating that the Kalos games are arguably the easiest in all of Pokemon history. And unfortunately, that just makes this Superboss battle a bit more underwhelming. So the battle with him or her will occur in Cloud City just north of the Battle Miason. And then as for the battle itself, it's alright. Just alright. Obviously, our rival's team will vary based on which starter you selected, but the only members of their team that will actually change are their starter Pokemon as well as their evolution. Now at a first glance, the levels of their Pokemon might actually seem relatively high, but remember, this is X and Y. The game's with ungodly amounts of experience, so there is actually a pretty high chance that you will outlevel your rival. Another jarring red flag is half of your rival's team doesn't even have full movesets. And yes, that includes their starter. The biggest threat on his or her team will of course be that Mega Absol, which by all means is very solid, and it's like one of the 4 Megas that you actually get to fight in X and Y. And if this thing is able to get up a Swords Dance, it can actually be pretty threatening. But besides that, their teams aren't super great. I guess the battle will be at its most challenging if you chose Chestnut as your starter. But, come on, you didn't choose Chestnut as your starter. But in closing on your X and Y rival, it's just a somewhat forgettable battle and a relatively easy one at that. In 11th place, we have Green. Now, we actually have a fun one here with Green from the Let's Go games. And honestly, she's the first decent Superboss on this entire list, as she does offer us a very solid challenge and can be sneaky tough. I'm sure most of you guys know her from her adaptation from the Adventures manga, where she is a fun and mischievous character. Luckily, that same personality is carried right over here into Let's Go, as she instantly launches a Pokeball at us. I guess we kind of surprised her, and she must have mistaken us for a Pokemon. And I honestly found this moment to be super funny the first time I saw it. But then when we do battle her, it's actually pretty tough. First, we have to be a little honest here. The Let's Go games are disrespectfully easy, but Green is actually a very challenging matchup. Her team is legit and pretty well diversified. And wow, would you look at that? All of her Pokemon have full movesets. That's something that can't even be said about the champions of those games. Her Clefable is honestly such a solid lead. It's got a great typing and it has some great natural bulk. And of course, it'll look to set up screens to make the rest of her team just as bulky. And the rest of her team is almost just as solid. We all know how great of a Pokemon Gengar is, and that Kangaskhan is no joke either. But her best Pokemon is of course her Blasty, which she will Mega Evolve right away, and this thing becomes a monster. Its special attack is massive while still having some solid bulk, and it even comes equipped with Ice Beam to handle any Grass-type Pokemon. Then, once we do take her down, she whips out her balls one more time, but this time we do get to keep them as a reward for beating her. For the Let's Go games being so underwhelming, I do really appreciate how they handled Green here. I always found her to be a very interesting character, and I love getting the chance to battle against her. In 10th place is Warden Ingo. Alright, so here we're looking at Ingo from Legends Arceus. A fun fact about him is that he's actually from the Battle Subway in Unova, and he does get transported back in time with us in Legends Arceus. Maybe you already knew this, but I didn't, because I normally just mash the A button during those long dialogue scenes. But okay, the final battle with Ingo is basically the last real trainer in PLA. This final match with him takes place after beating Volo and after capturing Arceus. And well, his team is ridiculously juiced. All of his Mons are level 75 or higher, and all of his Mons are alpha Pokemon. While all of his team members are very high leveled, his composition is a little bit weird though. With the exception of that Alakazam, none of his Pokemon are really all that scary. Most of them are just super slow. And with the way battling works in Legends, you might be able to fire off multiple attacks before they can even move. But regardless of the speed, all of his Mons are massively powerful and very high leveled for a game that's kinda difficult to level grind in. But he lands relatively low on this list because the battle with him is not all that iconic, memorable, and honestly, I bet most of the fandom doesn't even know about this one. Next up, we have Colress. As you probably know, Colress is one of the head honchos of Neo Team Plasma in Black 2 and White 2. Throughout the sequel games, you'll battle him a handful of times, and I mean, he's alright. He's definitely not as cool as a character like Energetsis, but he's at least kinda got a cool design. As for the battle itself, it is a tad underwhelming, but it can still be kind of difficult. He is a Steel Specialist, which is an objectively great typing. However, his team itself is a bit of a mixed bag. I find it to be very redundant that he uses both a Magneton and a Magnezone. Now, Magneton does have an Eviolite, and that's really cool because Gen 5 is when that item came out. But then why does he need to have a Magnezone too? It kind of defeats the purpose. I feel as if this team spot could have gone to a different Pokemon to give him a bit more much needed type diversity. Had Game Freak given him something like a Lucario or Ferrothorn, then yeah, he actually might have ended up a bit higher on this list. But the rest of his team is still goodish. Metagross is obviously a monster, and the same can be said about a shift-gearing Klinklang. His Rotom Wash is a good wall, but for some reason it's carrying a Life Orb. And then finally, his Behehem is Doggy Doodoo, and it really shouldn't be on his team at all. I will give Colress some kudos though, as after you beat him as a Superboss, he does give you a Master Ball, which is actually super cool, and I think this is the only time in franchise history where something like this happens. In closing, it's not that he's a terrible Superboss, it's just he's a bit underwhelming. The Black 2 and White 2 postgame is filled with some awesome content, but battling a somewhat forgettable villain really falls flat by comparison. Now in 8th place, we have Nemona. So in my champion ranking video, I did not in fact count Nemona as a champion. This is because I actually consider her to be more of a super boss than a true champion. Okay, so first let's talk about Nemona as a character. And she's quite honestly one of the best we have gotten in modern Pokemon. She is an awesome and challenging rival who really stuck out amongst a cast of pretty boring characters from Paldea. But now let's discuss her role as a super boss. So the battle with her takes place in the epilogue of the Teal Mask DLC. And just like always, Nemona offers us a massive challenge. Her team's obviously pretty fluid based on which starter we selected. However, she will always lead off with a Lycanroc. A Lycanroc that will in fact look to set up Stealth Rocks, which is kind of a bit wild for a normal in-game battle. But besides the Rock Dog, she will also always have a powerful Komo-o and a solid Pawmot too. Then the rest of her team will vary based on which starter Pokemon you selected. While all of her teams are very strong, I'd say her toughest team will come if you the player selected Fuecoco. Mostly because her team will have so many counters to a Skeledirge, as well as just great Pokemon overall. Milotic is obviously a very solid and bulky Pokemon, then Infernape and Meowscarada are objectively great, and these two actually do an incredible job of covering each other's weaknesses. But regardless of her team composition, she will always offer a major challenge. Everything on her team is level 86 or higher, which does make her the highest leveled super boss we have seen thus far. In all, I really only have 2 faults with this super boss battle against my queen Nemona. Those being 1, none of her Pokemon actually have held items, which definitely nerfs her. And 2, you have to buy expensive DLC to even experience this awesome battle. But other than that, Nemona is an absolute rock star and an awesome super boss. In 7th is Steven Stone. Why Game Freak made the decision to have Wallace take the champion crown from Steven in Emerald is something I will never understand. However, in Pokemon Emerald, we still get the opportunity to take on Steven, and here, he's even more powerful. After you become champion, you can find Steven deep within Meteor Falls, and his team here is actually the exact same as it was in Ruby and Sapphire. Except here, all of his Pokemon are ridiculously high leveled, and they all have much better movesets as well. His Skarmory is a very solid and very bulky lead with very few counters in Hoenn. Then his Claydol is another great utility mon, as it'll look to set up screens for the rest of his team. He also has both Hoenn fossils who play very well off each other and actually have very few counters. Meanwhile, he also has an Aggron, who's normally a very scary Pokemon, but Steven's here is for some reason a special attacker. But still, his Metagross is as threatening as ever here. Here in its Super Boss form, it comes in at a scary level 78. And I mean, this thing has some of the best stats in the entire game. Mix in a sick and diverse moveset as well as a Citrus Berry, and this thing's gonna be a beast in battle. So this means, even when Steven isn't technically the champion, he is still the strongest trainer in Hoenn. And in this Super Boss battle with him, it's just never gonna be easy. Next up is Barry. Serena and Callum, please take notes, because this is how a rival Super Boss battle is supposed to go. Barry might be a bit of a goofball, but as a Super Boss, he actually brings the boom. Here, we're taking a look at the post-game weekend battles in Pokemon Platinum. Initially, it's kind of a tough battle as Barry is a pretty solid rival in his own right. But if we want to face Barry at his absolute best, then you're actually gonna have to beat the Elite Four a whopping 20 different times. But once you do, Barry turns into a Pokegod with this team. I mean, just look at the levels of these Pokemon. And trust me, everything's gonna hit really hard. Most of his team is absolutely sick, but I really have to highlight Barry's starter. It'll come in at the insane level of 85, and it can totally wreck your entire team. And actually, for an entire year of real life time, Barry's starter here was actually the strongest NPC Pokemon in history. Now this was quickly dethroned by a certain yellow mouse, but I'm sure we'll see more on that later. To be honest, this battle here with Gary is the toughest overall we have seen thus far on this list. The main reasons as to why he only comes in at 6 is because he's super goofy, which doesn't give off Superboss vibes, and it's also really difficult to get him at his best for this battle too. In 5th place is Wally. Now, I honestly believe that Wally is the most underrated rival in any Pokemon game. Sure, he's not as iconic as Blue, and he's definitely not as mean as Silver, but he is a really unique character and a pretty powerful rival, and it was really cool to see him grow even more in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. And it's actually in the remakes where we get to square off with him, where he works as the Superboss of those games. Here in this final Superboss battle with him, his team is absolutely sick. He actually makes a ton of changes to the team that you saw him use in Victory Road. He now has a Roserade, Talonflame, Azumarill, Magnezone, Garchomp, and of course, his Gallade. Now this team is very well balanced and has some major hard hitters like Talonflame, Garchomp, and his Mega Gallade. But here in the final battle, all of his Pokemon are very high leveled, with his Gallade peaking at 81. And honestly, this team is actually competitively viable too. Every Mon here has the best ability possible, with Talonflame having Gale Wings, Azumarill with huge power, etc. But every Mon also has a really good equipped item as well. Garchomp has a Rocky Helmet that stacks onto its Rough Skin ability. Magnezone has an air balloon, for obvious reasons, and then finally is his Mega Gallade, who is far and away the strongest NPC Mon in all of ORAS. If this thing can set up just one Swords Dance, then you might quickly find yourself in some deep trouble. So yeah, Wally's team is super juiced, especially for such a meek and shy character. With the exception of his lead Roserade, just about any of these Pokemon can turn into sweepers and ruin your entire team. If you're able to unlock this Superboss battle with him, then you better be ready for the fight of your life. In 4th place, we have Cynthia. I know I said in the intro we aren't looking at league members or champions, but we're not talking about this version of Cynthia, we're talking about this version. Yep. As crazy as it might sound, I legitimately think it's a canon event for every single Pokemon player to unknowingly wander into that random house in Undella Town. I really don't think Cynthia needs any true introduction. We know her, we fear her, and for some reason, she made the inexplicable trip to Unova to fuel our nightmares in both sets of Black and White games. Yes, she is indeed in both the originals and in the sequels with pretty similar Superboss teams. However, I do find her Black and White team to be slightly tougher than the sequels. This is because she literally has 2 Pokemon with no weaknesses on her team, along with the rest of her usual powerhouse team members. We all know quite well how strong her Garchomp is, and the same holds true for both her Lucario and bulky Milotic. And actually, in the original Unovan games, she even has a powerful Braviary too. This team is just absolutely stacked, and all I can say to you is good luck. Then in the sequels, she might be slightly easier, but by no means is this actually an easy fight. Now, she has a Togekiss and Glaceon swapped in for Electros and Braviary. Glaceon is definitely a downgrade from Electros, but Togekiss actually might be better than Braviary. I mean, it is a full-on Paraflinch set, and I guarantee it'll give you a headache. Overall, Cynthia truly is a legend, and she is one of the most iconic and imposing characters in Pokemon history. In 3rd place, we have N. As a character himself, N is arguably the most beloved across the entire Pokemon franchise. He's just so layered and interesting, and one of the most fleshed out characters in the whole series. But here, we're going to be discussing the Superboss battle we have with him in the sequel games. So this battle takes place well after beating the League, and you actually already have to have beaten N once at his castle before you get to face off with him again. And here, he'll be using a different team based on this season. but every single Pokemon he uses comes in at the ever so high level of 80. And let's be honest, these levels are just insane, and there's a good chance you'll be pretty underleveled by comparison. If you ask me, I'd say his toughest squad to overcome is the Autumn team. This team is definitely the most versatile, and it's comprised of some pretty bulky Pokemon that actually do a great job of covering each other's weaknesses. And that's not to mention a good half of his team is getting defense boost, as this is more or less a sand team. His spring and summer teams could also end up giving you some trouble, but the Pokemon themselves are just a little bit weaker. Then his worst team is definitely his winter team. This is mostly due to the ice type just being so objectively terrible, but the Pokemon themselves aren't all that great either. But regardless of any of that, N is certainly deserving of his top 3 placement in this video, partially due to how powerful he is, but it's also partially because of how great of a character he really is. In second place, we have Volo. Yes, technically, Volo is indeed a Superboss. This final battle with him does take place well after the main story finishes and the credits roll. So now, let's discuss the match with Volo. And this battle might just be the hardest in Pokemon history. I'm sure by now you know just what makes it so difficult. But if for some foolish reason you skip Legends Arceus, here's a quick summary on what makes this fight nearly impossible. So Volo is the ancestor of Cynthia, so that automatically earns him some major battle clout. And his team itself is actually very similar to hers. He's got a very powerful and well-balanced squad with hard hitters like Togekiss, Lucario, and of course Garchomp. Taking down his full team of 6 is a solid challenge on its own, but once you beat them, you then have to square off with a flipping Giratina. And then if by some miracle you do beat Altered Form Giratina, you then have to square off with it again, this time in its origin form. And again, you still don't even get the chance to heal. So yeah, this battle is basically an 8v6. So from a mathematical standpoint alone, you're already totally outclassed. In PLA, there's actually a lot less trainer battles, so your team could be very underleveled, and there's a real chance that Volo's Mons will be able to fire off multiple attacks in a row. In all, there is no easy way to overcome this battle. You will almost certainly fall to Volo at least once, probably twice, and maybe even thrice. I guess your best bet to overcome this Superboss is to bring a Fairy and Ice type as well as a lot of heals. But the greatest Superboss in Pokemon history is Red. Yeah, I mean, how could it not be Red? Literally, whenever you think of Pokemon, the first trainer you think of is Red. And whenever you think of Superbosses in gaming, the first thing you also probably think of is still Red. Red personifies our past as he really is just us, but from the Kanto games. Then, as for the battle itself, Red's team really speaks for itself. In both sets of games, the core of his team remains the exact same. Pikachu, Charizard, Blastoise, Venusaur, and Snorlax are some of the most iconic and powerful Pokemon in the entire franchise. In the Gen 2 games, he uses an Espeon, who is a hard hitter and adds some diversity to his team. However, seeing as he is a Cantonian trainer, Espeon always kind of felt like a weird choice. So in the remakes, they swapped it out for a bulky and powerful Lapras. And while he is definitely a massive challenge in the originals, I think he's even stronger in the remakes. First of all, the levels of his whole team are insane. Everything here is at least level 80. Also, in the Johto games, it is very difficult to level grind, so there's a high chance you are gonna be vastly underleveled for this matchup. And remember earlier in the video when I said Barry's starter was for a short period the strongest leveled NPC Pokemon ever? Well, Red's Pikachu in the remakes quickly took its title back as it comes in at the insane level of 88. Oh, and that's not to mention that this thing also has a light ball. So good luck to ya. Unfortunately for us, there is just no easy counter to his team. There's no one specific Pokemon that you can use to carry you in this battle. Red's team is just very, very well-rounded and ridiculously high-leveled. And Red as a character himself is just as awesome. He says nothing, gives you the battle of your life, then vanishes. What a legend. What separates Red from pretty much all other super bosses on this video is that Red is the premier trainer in his respective game. By this, I mean in pretty much every other Pokemon game, your main goal is to just defeat the champion. However, in the Johto games, defeating Lance is definitely not the end-all be-all. Instead, your entire playthrough comes to a climax atop Mount Silver in an epic battle against Red. And for those reasons and so many others, Red is the greatest super boss, not just in Pokemon, but gaming history. Well guys, that is that. Those are my humbly genius rankings of every super boss in Pokemon history. Be sure to praise my rankings in the comment section below. Also, drop a big fat like on this video if you enjoyed. And definitely don't watch any of these videos on screen now, as they're probably too advanced and too epic for a normal person to consume. You're welcome, guys.